Hey there. Welcome to Midnight Sleep Crime. I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know many of you use this video to fall asleep. So, before you get cozy, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'd love to hear from you. Story 1. The neon sign outside the Willow Pines Motel buzzed faintly against the creeping dusk. Half its letters were dark, the rest struggling to glow against the fading light. It had once been the kind of roadside stop families used during long summer trips, back when the highway was new, when the road was the only way through this part of the state. Now, with the interstate bypassing the town entirely, the Willow Pines stood as a relic, still open, still occupied, but mostly by those with nowhere else to go. At 7:14 p.m. on September 3rd, a man walked into the lobby. The front desk clerk, an older woman named Doris Kempler, noticed him immediately. He didn't look like the usual stragglers they got, construction workers, traveling salesmen, the occasional trucker. He was tall, lean, dressed in clothes that didn't quite fit, a too large flannel shirt, jeans rolled at the cuffs, and a baseball cap pulled low. His face was ordinary enough, but Doris remembered his eyes. They were pale, washed-out blue, the kind of eyes that didn't seem to blink often. He placed a crumpled 20 on the counter. "Room," he said simply. Doris hesitated. The man hadn't said how many nights, or even if he wanted a smoking room or not. He didn't ask about the price, didn't look around, didn't smile. Just, "Room." "How many nights, sir?" she asked politely. "1." She gave him the key to room 6. Not many guests ever asked for it. Most people avoided it after rumors spread about a girl who once ran screaming from it in the middle of the night, back in the late 80s. Doris didn't believe in ghost stories, but she also didn't discourage them. Rumors kept kids away, kept the curious from asking too many questions. Still, she had a moment of unease as she slid the heavy brass key across the desk. The man picked it up, turned without a word, and walked out into the dimming evening. The last guest seen. The Willow Pines wasn't equipped with fancy security. No cameras in the hallways, no keycard locks, just old-fashioned keys and Doris's memory. But people noticed things, and the man's arrival was noted by more than one guest. A family staying in room 4 saw him as he walked past their window. The father, Jack Mills, would later recall the way the man moved, slow, deliberate, like he was counting his steps. The Millses' teenage daughter said she thought he was carrying something under his shirt, something heavy that bulged at his waist. He went into room 6 at 7:23 p.m. The door closed. The light inside flicked on. After that, no one saw him again. The sounds in the night. Room 7, next door, was occupied by a traveling insurance salesman named Harold Fitch, a man who spent more nights in motels than in his own house. He was used to hearing odd noises, dripping faucets, TV sets left on too loud, couples arguing through thin walls. But what he heard from room 6 that night was different. At 11:02 p.m., Harold was woken by a sound like furniture scraping. Then a dull thud. Silence followed, but only for a moment. A few minutes later came another noise, muffled, strained, like someone trying not to cry out. He sat up in bed, listening. He thought about calling the front desk but decided against it. The Willow Pines wasn't a place where you asked questions. People who stayed here didn't want attention, and he wasn't about to risk being the guy who got involved in something ugly. He turned up the TV and tried to go back to sleep. At 12:30 a.m., he was woken again, this time by what sounded like dragging. A long, heavy drag across the floorboards. Then the sound of the door opening. Footsteps in the gravel lot outside. He peeked through the curtains. The lot was empty, except for the man's beat-up gray sedan, parked crookedly in the back row. The door to room 6 was shut tight, the lights still on inside. By 1:15 a.m., the motel had gone silent. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Doris walked past room 6 on her way to deliver fresh towels. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again, called out, "Housekeeping." Still nothing. She tried the handle. The door was locked from the inside. She frowned. Guests often left without checking out, but they almost never left the key inside. At noon, after the man hadn't returned, she used the master key. The room was empty. At first glance, it looked normal. Bed made, bathroom neat, curtains half drawn. But Doris noticed something strange. The sheets on the bed weren't the motel's. They were darker, newer, and smelled faintly of bleach. Beneath them, the mattress was flipped, an oddity she chalked up to guests being careless. Still, when she lifted a corner, she froze. A large, dark stain spread across the underside. Her breath caught in her throat. She backed out slowly, locked the door again, and called the local sheriff. Sheriff Reeves arrives. Sheriff Daniel Reeves had been in law enforcement for 25 years. He wasn't the kind of man easily rattled, but he had a sense for when something wasn't right. The moment he stepped into room 6, he felt it. The air was wrong, heavy. He examined the mattress. The stain had soaked deep into the foam. Blood. He didn't need a lab test to know it. The pattern suggested not a nosebleed or a cut finger, but a pooling. A heavy loss of blood. Who stayed here last night? He asked Doris. Man. No name. Paid cash. Never filled the ledger. That was unusual. Motel policy required signatures, but Doris admitted she didn't press the man. Something about him made her want the encounter over as quickly as possible. The sheriff checked the bathroom. No toothbrush, no clothes, no suitcase. But the trash can contained one item, a pair of latex gloves, turned inside out, smeared faintly red at the fingertips. Reeves felt a chill run up his spine. The disappearance. By the end of that week, the town had its rumor mill running full speed. People whispered about the man in room 6, about what he had done and where he had gone. But what unsettled them most wasn't just the blood, or the missing name in the ledger. It was the fact that no one in that entire town seemed to know who had disappeared. There was no missing persons report that matched. No car abandoned in the lot. No one came asking after the guest. It was as if he had checked into room 6 and left behind only a stain. Sheriff Reeves wasn't convinced. Blood that much couldn't come from nowhere. Someone was missing. Someone who hadn't yet been reported. The motel room became sealed off with crime scene tape. For weeks, it sat untouched, the curtains drawn, the air inside growing stale. But the questions only deepened when the sheriff ordered the mattress removed. Beneath it, pressed into the plywood frame of the bed, were scratches. Deep gouges, uneven, as if made by fingernails. And next to them, faint but undeniable, a single word carved desperately into the wood. The motel's shadow. The discovery reignited old stories about the willow pines. Doris remembered the girl from the 80s, the one who had run barefoot into the night, claiming someone tried to kill her in room 6. Police had investigated back then but found nothing. The girl left town and the case died. Others recalled hearing noises over the years, thuds, cries, footsteps in the ceiling. Some swore the room was cursed, but Sheriff Reeves didn't believe in curses. He believed in people. People capable of things most folks didn't want to imagine. The investigation was just beginning, but one fact became clear. Whoever the man in room 6 was, he hadn't simply vanished. And whatever happened that night was not an accident. For the sheriff, this wasn't just another odd motel call. It was the start of something bigger. Something that stretched beyond the willow pines. Something that would lead to a discovery far darker than the town could ever prepare for. Because room 6 was only the beginning. The crime scene tape flapped in the late summer wind, a tattered yellow banner across the door of room 6. The Willow Pines Motel had never drawn much attention before, but now it had become the center of whispers, stares, and unwanted visitors. Local news vans parked on the roadside. Curiosity seekers slowed their cars to snap photos. For Sheriff Daniel Reeves, it was a headache. But for the victim, whoever they were, it was worse than that. The mattress alone told him enough to know something terrible had happened here. The evidence in plain sight. The mattress was removed the morning after the discovery, hauled awkwardly out of the narrow doorway by 2 deputies. Stains ran across its underside like a spreading shadow, dark brown where blood had dried into the foam. Reeves stood nearby, jaw tight, watching the men wrestle it into the back of a van. "Bag it. Don't let it touch the ground," he ordered. The deputies hesitated. "It weighs a ton, Sheriff." Reeves didn't care. To him, this mattress wasn't just evidence. It was a witness. and witnesses couldn't be contaminated. Inside the room, technicians dusted surfaces for prints, swabbed for DNA, and photographed everything. The flipped sheets, the carpet fibers, the latex gloves in the bin. But it was the mattress that gripped them all, like the silent testimony of someone whose voice had been stolen. First analysis. The state crime lab rushed the sample. Within 48 hours, Reeves had a preliminary report. The stain was confirmed as human blood. There was too much for it to have come from a minor wound. The quantity suggested significant blood loss, possibly fatal. But there was no body, no missing person report that fit. The motel had not recorded the guest's name, and the only person who could describe him was Doris, whose memory was of pale blue eyes and little else. That absence gnawed at Reeves. He returned to the room himself after the evidence crew had cleared it. The walls smelled faintly of bleach. The bathroom was spotless, unnaturally so. Yet, no matter how much scrubbing had been done, blood had still seeped deep into the mattress. Whoever had been in room 6 tried to clean up, but not thoroughly enough. Reeves knelt by the bed frame, staring at the scratches etched into the wood. He traced the grooves with his finger. They were frantic, jagged, uneven. Human. The carved word, help, stared back at him. That wasn't the work of the man who checked in. That was someone else. Theories take shape. The sheriff began to sketch out the possibilities. 1. The man in the flannel shirt had been the victim. Someone else lured him to room 6, overpowered him, and disposed of his body. 2. He was the perpetrator. He brought someone here, someone who bled, someone who fought, someone who carved into the wood, and then cleaned up after killing them. 3. It was a combination. 2 strangers, perhaps even more, involved in something that spiraled out of control. None of the theories fit cleanly. If the flannel man was the killer, where had he taken the victim? If he was the victim, who had seen him last? Why had no one reported a loved one missing? Reeves knew cases often began this way, shadows and unanswered questions, but the silence around room 6 felt heavier, more deliberate. Neighbors' accounts. He re-interviewed the motel guests. Harold Fitch from room 7 was nervous, lighting one cigarette after another as he spoke. Like I told you, Sheriff, I heard dragging. Furniture, maybe. Or a body. I don't know. I didn't want to stick my nose where it didn't belong. Did you hear voices? Reeves pressed. Fitch hesitated. Yeah. A man's voice. Low, firm. Then a woman's, muffled like she was gagged. That detail chilled the room. A woman. Up until then, no one had mentioned a woman. The family in room 4 didn't confirm it, but the teenage daughter, Lisa Mills, admitted something else. I saw him earlier. The man in the cap. He had blood on his shoes. Her parents scolded her for not saying it sooner, but Reeves knew teenagers notice things adults missed. Lisa had spent more time staring out the window that night than her folks had. The description was added to the report: gray sedan, male, late 30s to early 40s, tall, pale blue eyes, blood on shoes. Possibly traveling with a woman. Missing ledger. Doris finally admitted to something she had kept to herself. The guest log's gone, she said quietly when Reeves stopped by her desk. What do you mean, gone? I left it out. Always do. The next morning, it wasn't there. I thought maybe one of the deputies took it for evidence. But they hadn't. Someone had taken the log. Whether it was the man in room 6 or someone else, the effect was the same. The motel had lost weeks' worth of guest names. A whole pattern of comings and goings erased. It wasn't random. Someone didn't want room 6 to be traceable. The lab results. A week later, the lab returned more detailed findings. The blood on the mattress came from a female, type O. No matches in the state DNA database. The latex gloves carried traces of the same blood, along with faint skin cells from a male donor. Partial DNA profile, enough to run comparisons but not enough for a definitive ID. The sheriff stared at the report. Female victim. Male suspect. Just as Fitch had suggested. But who was she? A lead on the sedan. A deputy found the motel's old security camera. It wasn't aimed at the rooms, only the office entrance and parking lot. The grainy footage from that night showed the gray sedan pulling in at 7:10 p.m. The driver was the man Doris described. No visible passenger. At 1:42 a.m., the car pulled out of the lot. The driver remained the same. The footage wasn't clear enough to see if anyone else was inside. That was the last time the gray sedan was seen in Willow Pines. Expanding the net, Reeves contacted state police, issuing a bulletin for the vehicle, a mid-1990s Chevy Lumina, faded gray, missing hubcap. But days passed with no sightings. In the meantime, he expanded his search to missing persons. Women, type O blood, last seen within 100 miles of Willow Pines. That's when a name surfaced. Jessica Harrow, 27, reported missing by her sister 2 days after the Room 6 incident. Last seen in a small town 30 miles away, leaving a diner late at night. She drove an old Honda. It hadn't been found. Jessica's photo, brown hair, bright smile, hopeful eyes, was tacked onto the evidence board in Reeves's office. Could she be the woman in Room 6? The mattress tells more. Reeves ordered another round of analysis. This time, they cut deeper into the mattress. Hidden between layers of foam, the technicians found fibers, clothing fibers. A tear of denim, faint streaks of synthetic fabric, maybe from a blouse. The lab also found traces of something else, adhesive residue. Duct tape. The picture grew clearer. A woman restrained, bleeding, dragged across the mattress. Possibly gagged, possibly bound. Room 6 wasn't just the site of a struggle. It was a killing floor. The toll on the motel. The motel's business plummeted. Guests canceled reservations. Locals crossed the street rather than look at it. Doris tried to scrub the stain from her memory, but it lingered. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the pale eyes of the man who asked for room. She told the sheriff something one evening, voice trembling. He didn't blink, Sheriff. Not once. He just stared at me like I wasn't even there. Reeves wrote it down, though it unsettled him. Predators often looked right through people, as if sizing them up not as humans, but as prey. The case deepens. Within 2 weeks, investigators confirmed the blood belonged to Jessica Harrow. Her sister provided DNA for comparison. The match was undeniable. Room 6 had become the scene of Jessica's final moments. But the body was still missing. And without a body, there was no murder charge. Sheriff Reeves knew the man in the gray sedan wasn't done. Men like him didn't stop after one. They perfected their methods, moved on, chose new motels, new highways. The mattress had given him Jessica's name. Now he needed the man's. Reeves stood in the sealed room late one evening, looking at the carved "Please" scratched into the bed frame. The desperation of those letters. The last message of a dying woman. Hope. It wasn't just a word. It was a demand. And he intended to answer it. The Willow Pines Motel had always kept its records the old-fashioned way. A spiral-bound ledger with lined paper, each guest's name written in Doris Kempler's careful script. It was hardly secure, but in a town like Willow Pines, no one thought much of it. People came, people went. Nobody imagined those names might one day hold the key to a murder investigation. But now, that ledger was missing. And for Sheriff Daniel Reeves, its disappearance became just as important as the blood-stained mattress. The ledger that vanished. Doris swore she had left it where she always did, on the desk by the phone in the motel office. She'd used it the night the man checked into Room 6. She'd flipped open to a fresh page, pen ready, but he'd pushed the book away and tossed down his cash. The next morning, after she'd discovered the stain, the ledger was gone. At first, she assumed the deputies had bagged it. But when Reeves checked, they denied ever touching it. That meant one thing. Someone had come back. He replayed the motel's grainy security footage from that night, staring at the flickering black and white images. The gray sedan leaving at 1:42 a.m. Nothing after. No other vehicles entered the lot until morning. So when had the ledger vanished? And who had taken it? Why steal a guest log? Reeves considered the possibilities. If the man in Room 6 had taken it, he must have returned after dumping the body. Risky but possible. Or maybe someone else, an accomplice, another shadow lurking around the motel, had retrieved it to erase a trail. Either way, the theft suggested something bigger than a single murder. If all the killer wanted was to hide his victim, there'd be no need to erase weeks of names. But if there was a pattern, If he'd used the motel before, then that ledger was a map of his crimes. And someone had gone to great lengths to make sure it disappeared. Patterns in the rooms. With the ledger gone, Reeves started looking at Doris's memory. She wasn't perfect, but she'd worked the desk nearly every night for 15 years. He asked her, "Have you ever seen that man before? Not just last week, but any time." Her brow furrowed. "I don't know. Maybe. We get drifters, Sheriff." Faces blur together. "Think harder." She hesitated. "There was another time. Years back. A man checked into room 6. Paid cash. Didn't sign the log. I thought it was odd, but I let it go." She couldn't say exactly, but the detail stuck with her because he'd asked for room 6 specifically, just like the pale-eyed man had. Reeves scribbled in his notebook. "For repeat customer, maybe more than once. Talking to locals." The sheriff widened his net. He interviewed the cleaning staff, 2 part-time high school kids, a middle-aged man who handled repairs, and Doris herself. One name came up twice. A man in a cowboy hat who sometimes stayed at the motel. No one knew his real name. He drove different cars each time. He never stayed more than one night. Reeves dug deeper, asking the town's bartender, the diner waitresses, the gas station attendant. They all remembered him vaguely. Polite, quiet, paid in cash. Always gone by dawn. The description lined up eerily close to Doris's memory of the room 6 guest. Tall, thin, eyes pale as glass. But without the ledger, all they had were anecdotes. A ghost drifting through town. Tracing the paper trail. Reeves decided to check financial records. Even cash left traces. If the killer withdrew it from ATMs, if he purchased supplies nearby. Sure enough, a bank camera 2 towns over caught an image 2 days before Jessica Harrow vanished. A tall man in a flannel shirt, baseball cap pulled low, withdrawing $300. The photo was blurry, but the pale eyes were there. No name yet, but the net was tightening. A motel's history. As Reeves pursued leads, he started looking into the motel itself. Willow Pines had been open since 1964, a relic of the highway era. Hundreds of travelers had passed through, but buried in the county records were troubling signs. 3 unsolved disappearances in the last 20 years, all with one detail in common. The victims were last confirmed near Willow Pines. 1998, a teenage runaway, never found. 2005, a hitchhiker dropped off near the motel, vanished. 2012, a young man traveling cross-country, last seen gassing up 2 blocks away. Each case had gone cold, but each one circled back to the motel. Reeves's blood ran cold. Had room 6 been a hunting ground for decades? Forensic surprise. The lab called again with an update. On the mattress, beneath the top stain, they had found older traces of blood. Different genetic profiles. Male and female. It wasn't just Jessica's blood in that room. There had been others. The missing ledger now loomed larger than ever. If it contained the names of other victims, it was the Rosetta Stone of the case. Without it, Reeves was chasing shadows. The community reacts. Word of the missing ledger spread fast. The local paper ran a headline, "Guest book gone missing, motel murders multiply?" Panic spread through town. Parents forbade their kids from walking past the motel. Travelers avoided it entirely. Some locals whispered that Doris herself was in on it, that she had destroyed the ledger to protect someone. She denied it tearfully, but suspicion clung to her like smoke. For Reeves, it was more pressure. The town wanted answers. And fast. An unexpected break. One evening, Deputy Carla Ruiz came into the sheriff's office holding a thin envelope. "Got something," she said, dropping it on his desk. Inside were 3 receipts, all from a gas station 20 miles south of Willow Pines. Each one purchased late at night, all cash transactions, but each receipt bore a stamp, room 6. Reeves blinked. Why the hell would a gas station stamp motel rooms? Ruiz explained, owners got a deal with motels. Guests can use vouchers for fuel. Clerk stamps the receipt with the room number so the motel can reimburse him later. Motels stopped doing it years ago, but looks like someone forgot to toss the old stamper. And somehow, room 6 had been stamped. The receipts were dated 6 months apart. 2019, 2021, and just 3 weeks before Jessica's disappearance. Proof, at last, that room 6 had repeat visitors tied to the same mystery man. The cowboy hat connection. Cross-referencing the receipts with surveillance, Reeves got lucky. The gas station had kept old footage on a cloud server. On the night of the 2021 receipt, the camera caught him, the man in the cowboy hat. Totally lean pale eyes. Buying gas in cash. Now the pattern was undeniable. This wasn't random. He had been circling Willow Pines for years, slipping in and out like smoke. The missing ledger hadn't erased him completely. There were still cracks. And Reeves was determined to wedge them open. A visit to Jessica's sister. Reeves drove out to meet Jessica's sister, Megan. She lived in a modest ranch house, the kind of place where grief hung in the curtains. Photos of Jessica were everywhere. Jessica with her dog, Jessica in graduation robes, Jessica holding her niece. Megan's eyes were hollow. "I knew she was in trouble, Sheriff. She called me 2 nights before she vanished. Said a man was following her, watching her at the diner. I told her to call the police. She said she didn't want to make a fuss." Reeves felt a chill. What did she say about him? Megan hesitated. That he never blinked. The words echoed Doris's earlier description. The puzzle without its corner piece. Back at the office, Reeves pinned Jessica's photo next to the timeline. He drew lines connecting her to the mattress, to the gas station receipts, to the cowboy hat figure. But the missing ledger loomed like a black hole. Without it, he couldn't connect the other dots, the other victims, the other nights. He stared at the evidence wall, jaw tight. Somewhere out there, the ledger existed. Hidden in a drawer, buried in a field, burned to ash. If he could find it, he could name the dead, expose the killer, and shut down the Willow Pines curse forever. But until then, Room 6 remained a place of unanswered questions. And the pale-eyed man was still out there, slipping down back roads, checking into nameless motels, looking for his next victim. Closing in. That night, Reeves couldn't sleep. He kept replaying Jessica's sister's words. He never blinked. He pictured those pale eyes in the motel lobby, staring through Doris. He pictured Jessica, carving help into the bed frame with her last desperate strength. And he pictured the ledger, pages fluttering, names written in ink, each one a breadcrumb leading straight to the midnight border. Reeves knew one thing with absolute certainty. The ledger wasn't missing. It had been stolen. And whoever stole it wasn't just covering their tracks. They were protecting the killer. The night the stranger checked into Room 6, the motel wasn't empty. Room 7, right next door, had been occupied by a man named Henry Talbot, a trucker who'd pulled off the interstate to catch a few hours of rest before hauling another shipment north. Henry wasn't the type to pay attention to what went on around him. He'd been sleeping in roadside motels for the better part of 2 decades and learned to ignore strange noises, slamming doors, or late-night arguments. But something about that night at the Crosswind Motel kept him awake. Something that stuck with him long enough that, when detectives finally questioned him, he hesitated before speaking. It wasn't the sort of thing you forget. A restless night. Henry remembered the motel being unusually quiet when he first checked in. He had parked his rig along the edge of the gravel lot, leaving the cab idling for a few minutes as he filled out the sign-in sheet. The lobby smelled faintly of mildew and coffee gone stale. "I'll take whatever's cheap," Henry had told Ellen Marks, the owner. She slid a key across the counter. Room 7. From the start, Henry had felt uneasy. The neon sign outside his window buzzed and flickered, bathing the curtains in sickly pink light. He dozed for maybe an hour before the sound started, at first faint, then insistent. A muffled thud, followed by another. Henry sat up in bed, the sheets twisted around his waist. The sound was coming through the wall that separated his room from Room 6. At first he thought it was just someone dropping their bag, or maybe stumbling around drunk. But then he heard something else, something that made the hair on his arms prickle. A voice. Not loud, not clear, but strained, as though someone was trying to speak through a gag. The dragging sound. Henry leaned closer to the wall, pressing his ear against the faded floral wallpaper. For a moment, there was only silence. He began to wonder if fatigue was playing tricks on him. And then came the dragging sound. Slow, heavy. Something, or someone, being pulled across the floor. Henry's chest tightened. He'd heard plenty of things in motels over the years. Fights, lovemaking, televisions blasting until dawn. But this sound was different. It carried weight. It carried finality. He swallowed hard, debating what to do. Knock on the wall? Step outside and check? Or mind his own business? The decision was taken from him when the sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a dull creak of the bed frame in room 6. Then, silence again. A face at the window. Henry tried to sleep after that, but the unease wouldn't let him. He turned the television on low, hoping the background noise might drown out his imagination. Around 3 a.m., he finally got up to smoke a cigarette outside. The night air was damp. A mist hung over the empty lot. Henry lit up and glanced toward the row of windows, his eyes landing on room 6. The curtain there twitched. Just for a second. As though someone inside had been watching him. Henry froze, cigarette halfway to his lips. And then he saw it, the face. Gaunt. Eyes wide with something between terror and desperation. It disappeared almost instantly, yanked back into the darkness, but Henry knew what he had seen. Someone was in trouble. Fear of involvement. But Henry Talbot wasn't a hero. Not that night. Not ever. He stubbed out the cigarette, muttering to himself that it wasn't his business. He had a delivery schedule, a life that didn't need the complication of police reports or statements. He'd seen too many drivers lose contracts because they got wrapped up in things that weren't theirs to handle. So Henry went back into room 7, locked the door, and forced himself to lie down. The noises didn't return, but the silence was somehow worse. When dawn broke, Henry loaded up his truck and drove off, leaving the Crosswind Motel behind. He didn't mention the face at the window. He didn't mention the dragging sound. He kept it to himself. Until the detectives came knocking. Detective Reeves returns. Detective Caleb Reeves was convinced the motel had more witnesses than Ellen was letting on. The blood-stained mattress was evidence enough that something violent had occurred, but without testimony, he was grasping at shadows. Ellen, under pressure, finally handed over a copy of the guest registry, minus the missing page from the ledger that had mysteriously disappeared. That was when Reeves noticed Henry Talbot's name listed for room 7. They tracked him down at a truck stop 3 towns over. Henry looked startled when Reeves slid into the booth across from him. Crosswind Motel, Reeves said without preamble. Room 7. Tell me what you heard. Henry's eyes flicked away, settling on his half-eaten plate of eggs. I don't know what you're talking about. Reeves leaned closer. You do. And if you don't tell me, the next person who stays in room 6 might end up the same way. Henry's jaw tightened. He tried to resist. But eventually, the words spilled out, halting, uncertain, but enough to change the course of the investigation. The testimony. Henry described the thuds. The dragging. The muffled cries. The face at the window. Reeves listened intently, jotting notes. His pulse quickened at the mention of the face. This wasn't just noise, wasn't just speculation. Someone had been alive in room 6. Someone who had tried to signal for help. Could you describe the face? Reeves asked. Henry hesitated. It was quick. Real quick. But yet, thin. Maybe a woman. Early 20s, maybe younger. She looked terrified. Reeves closed his notebook. The case had just shifted from a suspicious disappearance to a probable abduction or murder. Ellen's reaction. When Reeves returned to the motel to confront Ellen with Henry's testimony, her reaction was strange. She didn't look shocked. She looked resigned. I told you, she said quietly. This place, things happen here. They always have. What do you mean? Reeves pressed. But Ellen shook her head. Doesn't matter. Nothing good comes out of digging too deep. Her refusal to elaborate frustrated Reeves, but he noted the tremor in her hands as she handed him the spare key to room 6. If you're going to find anything, she whispered, you'll need to look where others haven't. The night watchman. That evening, as Reeves prepared to re-examine room 6, he met another figure, Carl Jennings, a part-time night watchman Ellen had hired to keep an eye on the property after the incident. Carl was a wiry man in his 60s with watery eyes and a nervous tic. You looking into room 6? Carl asked. Reeves nodded. Carl rubbed his jaw. I've been saying it for years. That room ain't right. People check in, and sometimes they don't check out. I've seen folks leave in the middle of the night, bags half-zipped, like they were running from something. Running from who? Reeves asked. Carl looked toward the darkened row of rooms, his voice dropping. Not from who? From what's in there. A deeper unease. That night, Reeves walked through room 6 again, flashlights sweeping the corners. The blood stain beneath the mattress seemed darker now, almost as if it had grown. He crouched by the wall Henry had pressed his ear against. The wallpaper was torn slightly at the baseboard. When he pulled it back, he noticed something, a thin, jagged crack running the length of the wall. A passage for sound. Maybe even for air. Reeves tapped it with his knuckles. Hollow. The unease settled deeper in his bones. Somewhere between room 6 and room 7, between the lives of those who checked in and the silence that followed, something was hiding. And Reeves intended to find it. The Cloverleaf Motel had always been a quiet, unassuming spot along the old highway. Tucked between a gas station and a closed-down diner, it was the kind of place travelers stopped at when they couldn't make it to the bigger chain hotels farther into town. Its neon sign, humming faintly at night, promised clean rooms, low rates. But as Detective Laura Callahan stared at the worn paint peeling from the office door, she couldn't shake the feeling that this motel was more than just a pit stop. It was hiding something. She had spent the last 2 weeks piecing together the events surrounding room 6, chasing leads about the mysterious drifter who'd checked in and then seemingly vanished. She had interviewed the owners, cross-examined staff, and spoken to every guest who would talk. Yet what troubled her most wasn't just what had happened in room 6, it was the motel's history itself. The old records. The motel's current owner, Leonard Briggs, had only taken over a decade ago. Before that, the property had gone through at least 3 different hands since it was first built in 1964. Leonard kept a locked filing cabinet behind the reception desk, where dusty folders and yellowed papers sat largely untouched. When Laura asked if she could go through them, Leonard hesitated. Most of that's just old bills, repair work, junk. Nothing useful, he said. But Laura was insistent. Sometimes the past leaves patterns. I need to see them. Reluctantly, Leonard handed over the key. Laura pulled the bottom drawer open and found stacks of receipts, payroll records, and guest ledgers dating back decades. She spread them across the counter, scanning each with growing unease. In the ledgers, certain dates were circled in red ink, notations from a long-gone manager. Next to them were handwritten notes. Guest never checked out. Police notified. Another read, room abandoned. Left belongings behind. And almost all of them had one thing in common. They were connected to room 6. A pattern emerges. The first disappearance was recorded in 1971. A traveling salesman named Harold Wexler had checked into room 6 on a rainy March night. According to the record, he never officially checked out. The manager at the time, a man named Curtis Downs, had contacted local police, who filed a missing persons report. Wexler's car was later found abandoned 30 miles down the interstate. No trace of him was ever found. The next case came in 1979. A young woman named Janice Holloway, age 24, was last seen leaving her apartment in Tulsa. Her car broke down near the Cloverleaf Motel, where she took a room for the night. She vanished the following morning. Police combed through her room, room 6, and found her purse and suitcase neatly placed on the bed. No signs of struggle, no forced entry. Just gone. There were more. In 1986, a runaway teenager. In 1992, a truck driver. In 2001, a hitchhiker traveling cross-country. Each time, room 6. Laura's skin prickled as she jotted notes. Could this be coincidence, or was something far more sinister buried here? Locals remember. Laura drove to the small-town library and began combing through archived newspapers. Microfilm word as old headlines flickered across the screen. Salesman disappears after motel stay. Police baffled by vanishing of young woman. Highway mystery, another drifter gone missing. Though none of the cases had ever been solved, whispers had circulated for years. One article quoted a local diner waitress, "That motel gives me the creeps. Folks check in and don't always check out." Curious, Laura tracked down longtime residents. Many were reluctant to talk, but one elderly man named Hal Simmons agreed to sit down with her. Hal, a retired trucker, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "I stayed there once, back in '85. Room 6. Worst night of my life." Laura's pulse quickened. "What happened?" Hal scratched at his whiskered chin. "Middle of the night, I heard someone knocking at my door. Not just a knock, more like scratching. Thought it was a stray animal at first. When I got up, no one was there. Later, I woke up to what sounded like whispering coming from inside the walls. Couldn't sleep a wink. Left at dawn and never went back." Laura pressed him for more, but Hal only shook his head. "Some places just aren't right. That room's cursed, detective. Always has been." The suicide. While cross-referencing old police records, Laura stumbled across something chilling. In 1969, just 5 years after the motel was built, a guest in room 6 had taken his own life. A man named Gregory Ames, 42, was found hanging from the ceiling light fixture by a belt. His note read only, "I can't get rid of the voices." This detail was never widely publicized, but it stuck with Laura. Voices. Whispers. Scratching. Had room 6 been attracting darkness from the very beginning? The owner's silence. Laura brought these findings back to Leonard. She laid out copies of the records on his desk, pointing to the repeated pattern. "Room 6 isn't just unlucky," she said. "It's a graveyard of unsolved disappearances." Leonard shifted uncomfortably. "Look, detective, I bought this place cheap. The bank didn't mention any of this. If I'd known." "But you had to have heard the stories," Laura pressed. His eyes flickered. "Rumors. That's all they were. I figured people just made things up. I didn't want to scare off guests." Laura studied him carefully. His reluctance to talk made her uneasy. Was he simply a desperate businessman trying to keep the motel afloat, or was he hiding something more? Ghost stories. By now, word of the investigation had spread, and Laura started receiving anonymous tips. One was a letter slipped under her office door with shaky handwriting. "Ask about the boy who saw through the floor." Another was a late-night call from a woman who refused to give her name. "My aunt stayed in room 6 in the '80s. Said she woke up to see a man standing at the foot of her bed. When she turned on the light, he was gone. She checked out the next morning and never traveled alone again." Though Laura was skeptical of ghost stories, she couldn't ignore the consistent theme. Fear centered on room 6. Whether psychological or something more, the room had a hold on people. The hidden police files. Determined to dig deeper, Laura requested restricted case files from county archives. Hours later, a courier delivered a cardboard box stamped "Confidential." Inside were crime scene photos, police reports, and handwritten notes from past detectives. One in particular caught her attention, a 1979 report on Janice Holloway. Tucked inside the folder was a Polaroid of room 6 taken after she vanished. The photo showed her belongings neatly stacked on the bed. But what disturbed Laura most was something in the background. A dark smear on the carpet, near the edge of the bed frame. The report made no mention of blood testing, but Laura's instincts told her otherwise. Then she found a note scrawled by the lead investigator, "Suspect local involvement." Not enough evidence. Her pulse quickened. Local involvement. Did that mean a motel employee? A townsperson? Back to the room. That evening, Laura returned to room 6. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the neon sign outside buzzed faintly through the window. She stood in the center of the room, letting the silence press in. The faded wallpaper, the creaking floorboards, the faint smell of mildew, none of it seemed remarkable. But she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Dropping to her knees, she examined the carpet. Newer than the rest of the motel, it had clearly been replaced within the last decade. She ran her hand across the seam near the wall and found a section where the adhesive was loose. With a sharp tug, she pulled it back and froze. Beneath the carpet was a faint, discolored stain. Rust brown. Blood. A motel of secrets. By the time Laura stood, her hands were shaking. The Cloverleaf Motel wasn't just unlucky. It was a magnet for tragedy, and someone over the years had gone to great lengths to bury the evidence. She stared at the walls, imagining all the stories they'd absorbed. Harold Wexler, Janice Holloway, the runaway teen, the truck driver, the drifter. Lives swallowed whole, with Room 6 as their last known stop. The past wasn't just whispering, it was screaming. And Laura knew she was only scratching the surface of the motel's secrets. The question was no longer what had happened in Room 6. It was who had been making sure it kept happening. The sun was setting over Grayfield, casting the Desert Pines Motel in a coppery glow that did nothing to ease the unease already hanging over the property. Detective Sarah Holden sat in her unmarked car across the road, scribbling notes in her worn notebook. The past week had been nothing but dead ends and bizarre revelations. First, the stained mattress. Then the missing ledger. Then whispers, literal whispers, from the disused Room 7. Every clue seemed to reveal not just a crime but a labyrinth of secrets buried under the motel's peeling paint and decayed siding. Tonight, she was back, because something about the way the rooms were arranged gnawed at her. The old motel had always felt watched. The strange humming she swore she'd heard last night, almost like electricity, pushed her to come back with a different perspective. She closed her notebook and looked at the motel facade. 6 occupied rooms, 2 boarded up, and 1, the dreaded Room 7, sealed with police tape. As she walked across the cracked asphalt lot, she caught the faint flicker of fluorescent lights in the manager's office. The manager's deflection. Carl Benson, the motel's wiry, chain-smoking manager, sat slumped in his chair behind the counter, his thinning hair damp with sweat. His eyes darted up the moment Sarah entered. "Back again?" he said, trying to sound casual. His voice cracked. "I thought the police already cleared this place for now." "They did," Sarah replied. "But I have some follow-up questions. About the renovations you mentioned." Carl's jaw tensed. "What renovations? You said last week that the previous owners, the Websters, tried to modernize the place. They installed new lighting, did some electrical work." She leaned against the counter. "Did that include any security upgrades?" Carl's Adam's apple bobbed. "Not that I know of. Just paint, some wiring, nothing major. They didn't have the money." Sarah scribbled in her notebook, then looked up, fixing him with the kind of stare that left people squirming. "You wouldn't be lying to me, would you, Carl?" He forced a chuckle that came out more like a cough. "Why would I lie? Look around, this dump isn't exactly Fort Knox." But Sarah had already noticed it, a faint grid pattern etched into the plaster of the ceiling tiles near the counter. Almost invisible, like a concealed panel. She filed the detail away and stepped back into the night air. The discovery in Room 4. Room 4 was quiet, stale with the scent of mildew. Sarah had the key in her pocket. Carl had reluctantly given it to her after she signed a property release form. She closed the door behind her and flicked on the lamp. The shadows danced unnaturally in the corners. Sarah stood in the center of the room, her eyes scanning upward. That's when she saw it. A small, almost imperceptible circle carved into the acoustic ceiling tile above the bed. She dragged a chair across the room and climbed up. With her flashlight, she illuminated the spot, and her breath caught the pinhole camera lens. "Son of a," she whispered. Her pulse spiked as she pulled the tile back. Wires ran from the camera, disappearing into the ceiling cavity, bundled neatly with plastic ties. Whoever installed this wasn't sloppy. This was deliberate, professional even. Sarah dropped the tile and stepped down, her hands trembling. The camera was pointed directly at the bed. The ceiling maze. Heart racing, she sprinted back to her car, grabbed her inspection kit, and returned with gloves and a small stepladder. Tile by tile, she began lifting ceiling panels across rooms 2 through 6. Every single room had one. Hidden cameras wired together, all pointed at the beds. The wires ran like veins through the ceiling, converging toward a single location. Sarah followed them through the dark crawl space above the rooms, her flashlight beam slicing through the dust. Finally, she found it, a central hub above Room 7. An old electrical box, modified to contain recording equipment. Several outdated VHS tapes, stacked neatly, were jammed inside. The wires fed into a cluster of jerry-rigged splitters, each leading to a separate recording channel. Her chest tightened as she realized what she was looking at. For years, maybe decades, every guest who stayed here had been watched, recorded. But why hadn't anyone updated the system? Then the darker thought hit her. Maybe someone had. Maybe the newer equipment wasn't here. Maybe it had already been removed. The first tape. Sarah climbed down with one tape tucked into her evidence bag. She didn't dare take them all yet. She needed to proceed carefully. She drove straight to the precinct, the tape sitting in the passenger seat like a live grenade. In the media room, she inserted it into an old player. The screen buzzed with static, then cleared. A dimly lit motel room appeared. The bed was neatly made. Then a woman entered. Alone. She set her bag on the bed, kicked off her shoes, and sat down. She looked ordinary, mid-30s, travel-worn, adjusting her hair. Sarah leaned forward, horrified at the intimacy of the footage. The woman began to undress. Sarah hit fast forward, unable to stomach watching. The tape flickered forward, then froze. The woman jolted. Her head snapped toward the camera, as if she heard it. Then, suddenly, the footage warped. The screen went black. Sarah's stomach knotted. She rewound slightly. Same thing. The woman sensing something, turning toward the hidden lens, before the tape abruptly cut out. Not ended. Cut. Someone had deliberately stopped recording at that exact moment. A pattern emerges. Sarah pulled another detective, Reeves, into the room. "Tell me this doesn't look like staging," she said, replaying the moment. Reeves frowned. "Could be coincidence." "Coincidence doesn't stack up when every room in that motel has a camera aimed at the bed," Sarah shot back. This wasn't just voyeurism. This was a system. Organized. Reeves rubbed his temples. Jesus Christ. How many tapes? Dozens. He blew out a breath. If this goes back to the Websters, they could be tied to a peeping ring. But the cut footage, he shook his head. That feels like escalation. Like maybe it wasn't just watching. Sarah nodded grimly. Midnight returned. By midnight, Sarah was back at Desert Pines, parked across from the motel like a predator waiting for movement. The night was silent except for the buzz of a faulty neon sign. Carl's office light was still on. Sarah slipped out of her car, moving along the shadow of the building until she reached room 7. She ducked under the police tape and slipped inside. Her flashlight swept the walls, landing on the ceiling panel she had disturbed earlier. She dragged over the chair again and reached up into the crawlspace, pulling out a second tape, this one unlabeled, wrapped in an old rag. Her stomach dropped. The rag was stiff. Dried blood. The second tape. Back at the precinct, she and Reeves inserted the second tape. The footage was grainier, older. Room 7. A man sat on the edge of the bed, middle-aged, wearing a trucker's cap. He looked nervous. Then the door opened. 2 men entered, faces blurred by shadow, but their outlines were distinct. One tall and gaunt, the other heavy-set. They closed the door. The man on the bed stood, confused, gesturing with his hands. The 2 men lunged. The struggle was brief, violent. One of the intruders pulled something from his pocket. Plastic wrap? No, a bag. Sarah flinched as the victim was forced onto the bed, the bag pulled over his head. His legs kicked wildly, then slowed. Within minutes, he was still. The 2 men dragged the body out of frame. The tape cut to static. Reeves slammed his fist against the table. God damn it. That's murder. Sarah stared at the frozen screen, bile rising in her throat. And we've got it on film. Implications. The existence of this footage blew the case wide open. Desert Pines wasn't just a sleazy roadside stop. It was a hunting ground. The cameras weren't voyeuristic perversions. They were tools. Surveillance. A way to catalog victims before they were chosen. The Websters hadn't just run a motel. They'd run an operation. The missing ledger suddenly made sense. Names, room numbers, dates, cross-referenced with footage. And room 7? It hadn't just been haunted. It had been the execution chamber. Sarah closed her notebook, her hand shaking as she wrote her final line of the night. The cameras weren't for watching. They were for selecting.